Hello class, welcome to the History of Jazz Extra Credit. My name is Professor Thursday. We've talked quite a bit about the great fusion of music that took place in the late 1960s to the mid-1970s. This is a time where jazz, blues, rock, soul, funk, and R&B all intertwine with each other to form very unique genres of music. Today we're going to talk about a different kind of fusion that takes place at this time, which would lead us to Northern Soul. The significance of Northern Soul to the larger picture of music as we know it is highly underrated, which is kind of odd considering no new artists or new songs came out of this era for this movement. It's a stubborn cultural phenomenon that will shape music yet to come. To truly understand Northern Soul, we're going to have to take a look at a few moving parts. We're going to begin in 1945.
Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead.
Britain. The war is over, but the country has been devastated by rocket attacks from Germany. It's the time of rebuilding, and the country needs workers. The British Nationality Act of 1948 broke down many of the barriers of entry for immigrants of countries and territories under the rule of the British Empire. England needed workers to rebuild, and immigrants would help fill that role. The 1950s did wonders for the country as they rebuilt the infrastructure, converted heavily into a capitalistic society, and unemployment nearly disappeared. Towns and cities were reshaped by council estates, tower blocks, and shopping centers. Supermarkets transformed families' shopping habits, while television began to make inroads into their leisure time. For the first time in British history, the youth had disposable income that would dictate the changes in trends, fashion, and culture. Since this was the first time for the British government, the wants and needs of the youth were not catered to. This was especially true in terms of music. The British Broadcasting Company owned a monopoly of radio stations across the UK. Their programming was constricted by the English Musicians' Union. Since before the rise of radio and talking films, the union had been an advocate for the working musician, mostly for orchestras. The BBC had hired localized musicians for fixed hours, holiday pay, and salaries. With the rise of records, the Musicians' Union imposed limited play from records called needle drop time. At best, the BBC was allowed 30 minutes a day of needle drop time. The union had also strong-armed clubs and dance halls from playing records. The BBC was restricted with needle time, but it wasn't their only hurdle. If they wanted to play a song from an album, they needed to pay the union, pay the artist, pay the publisher, pay the writer, and of course, pay the record company. Their limited budget couldn't afford to play recorded music. However, since they employed their own musicians, they could play those recorded songs without too much cost to the company. Because of union laws, the BBC had to constantly re-record the same music with the same musicians time and time again. As we enter into the 1960s, the radio had taken a backseat as TV became the king of media. On TV, under the same restrictions by the Musicians' Union, music played on the TV had to be live. It didn't really matter if you could hear your favorite music on the radio if you could see your favorite bands played live on TV. Alternatively, you could go to the club and dance halls and hear live music. The BBC was given complete monopoly of the airwaves by the British government, and the Musicians' Union had complete control over the BBC in popular British venues. But not everybody was playing by the rules. There was another monopoly on the UK airwaves.
In the bath or in a bar, in the kitchen or in a car, you'll find a great 208. The rock and roll swinging station of the stars, yeah. On Radio Luxembourg 208.
From mainland Europe, Radio Luxembourg broadcasts from a small country of Luxembourg nestled between the countries of Germany, France, and Belgium. The country itself has an area of roughly 1,000 square miles, just under the same size of the state of Rhode Island. The station had a brief run from 1924 to 1935, where it was the start of the Second World War. After the war, they went back on air and increased their bandwidth so they're able to air programming across the British Isles and most of Europe without a British license. It was a commercial enterprise that did not bow to the musician union and the needle time statutes. The American GIs had introduced Europe to American radio programming and American popular music. The tradition carried over into Radio Luxembourg. In the post-war years, Radio Luxembourg played popular records from the States to the British youth, who demanded a record to be heard on air to be sold at the record shops in their communities. The first of these youth groups embraced rock and roll via U.S. servicemen, and they were called the Teddies. They embraced the cool, slick look of the 50s rockabilly aesthetic, complete with denim wear and loud motorcycles. The second group was part of the skiffle movement, where youthful musicians sought out how to play their version of pop music by studying American blues artists. This is where the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, and most of the British invasion comes from. In March 1964, at the dawn of the British invasion, Radio Luxembourg had competition. This is the era referred to as pirate radio.
Serving the British Isles, 14 swinging hours a day, this is 199 Radio Caroline.
319 Radio Caroline.
The first pirate radio station to go on air was from a ship, anchored 4 miles off the coast of southern England in international waters. Its name was Radio Caroline. Radio Luxembourg operated mostly in the evening and at night to take advantage of the skywave propagation, which allowed radio waves to extend further beyond their normal range. Radio Caroline had a ground wave signal strong enough not to be affected by fading or interference during the daylight hours. They could run 24 hours. Shortly after the commercial success of Radio Caroline, the international waters outside of the UK's coastal boundary became host to several new pirate radio stations, such as Radio Scotland, Radio Caroline North, Britain's Better Music Station, Radio City, Radio 390, Radio London, Radio England, Britain Radio, and Radio 270. These remodeled ships and naval platforms bombarded the British airways with American and British pop music. At the same time, America was being flooded with British pop music. With the change in technology, the British pirate radio stations took advantage of the new powerful transmitters in portable radios and inside cars. There was nowhere on the islands they couldn't reach. These pirate radio stations not only brought in American music, but American formatting as well. Each station had a handful of DJs that hailed from America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK itself. The popular DJ-driven format included vibrant DJ personalities and Americanized-style jingles, sweepers, and commercials.
It's the sound of music. Yes, on October the 1st, Radio London pushes forward with an entirely new sound for you on this channel. A sound that'll open up a new chapter in Radio London's history as the #1 commercial station in Great Britain. October 1, it's near, it's new, it's the date we burst open with the new sound of music.
That's our middle name. Wonderful music. VIGL. Radio London. Music now.
And now, it's that moment, folks, that you've all been waiting for. Top Deck time!
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, once again, this is Everett of England introducing Top Deck Time, brought to you by the makers of Rumba, which is flavored with real Jamaican rum. And now, a word from our producer, Bob Brooksby. Put a record on somebody quick.
So calm the feeling. I'm gonna fall in love with you.
Both Radio Carolines and Radio London competed heavily with Radio Luxembourg, who ultimately reformatted themselves to match the pirate radio stations. The BBC was woefully not even in the same league as the other stations and could not compete against what was well known as free radio. The Musicians' Union was equally not pleased by the new competition. The conservative government made several attempts to criminalize these stations through their advertisers and claims for interference of emergency bandwidths. The last bit was false information, but was enough to help pass the Marine Broadcasting Offensive Act in August of 1967. The act meant that the operation of offshore pirate radio stations became illegal if they were operated or assisted by persons subject to the UK law. It prohibited carrying by water or air goods or persons to or from it, which made tendering illegal. Station operators thought they could continue if they were fully staffed, supplied, and funded by non-British citizens, but this was largely proved impractical. Radio stations with limited budgets closed their doors before the law went into place, while others had to move, if they were able, to other waters to continue broadcasting. Those within UK's borders were captured and shut down. Some DJs went to jail. Some went to Radio Luxembourg. The popular DJs of Radio London, or Big L, Swinging London Radio, and the Carolines were all hired in by the BBC.
Here's news. Starting in September, the BBC begins a new service for fans of popular music. There'll be light, and then there's pop, and then there's always... excuse me. This is how Radio 247 will work. From September, the BBC Light program channel on the medium wave will split from the service on 1500 meters in the long wave band, and with a little help from a lot of the newer DJs on the scene, will provide music all day, going back to the light only for programs like Saturday Club, Midday Spin, and Housewife's Choice. Music, 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 all day on the new BBC popular channel 247.
On the following month, September of '67, the BBC reorganized their stations to Radio 1 for pop music, Radio 2 for easy listening, Radio 3 for classical music and cultural programming. Radio 4 became the station for news and other non-musical content. With needle time extended to 5 hours a day for each of the radio stations, the BBC worked around the restriction by playing cover versions of popular songs by bands and musicians they employed. These covers filled in the downtime on the radio station while managing the needle time for the day. In the late 60s, there was a new group of youths that emerged from London. These were called the Modernists, or Mods. They were easily identified by fashionable Italian clothes, riding on motorized scooters, and their thirst for trending music. Their counterpart were the Teddies, who wore denim and leather cuts, rode loud motorcycles, and had a passion for 50s rockabilly music. We've discussed them before in the history of punk and the rockabilly revival of the late 1960s. The Mods spoke to a more progressive, optimistic youth by looking forward to the future of Britain during some of the country's most trying times. The complete rejection from pop-charting playlists of the pirate radio stations and eventually Radio 1 pushed the Mods to find their own music to speak to them. They latched on to post-bop jazz, then modal jazz before switching to blues and then R&B soul. Soul music was a rarity in the country, and it became featured in Northern England's premier discotheque clubs. Motown songs first caught the attention of the Mods with its rock backbeat and its jazz harmonies. The Mods wanted a straight 4/4 time, constant beat, no swing, no time changes. In the mid-60s, the BBC radio broadcasters of the time did not play black American R&B Motown hits for the English demographic. Most of the music was piped in by pirate radio stations over the seas, but it had to compete with popular rock music of the era. Otherwise, record stores were the only other place to find black American music if they had it in stock, and if you knew enough to order it. Indie labels and minor artists may have found some airplay in clubs, but only in clubs that were lucky enough to own their records, and the clubs did not hire union musicians to play at any other time of the week. The Mods carried their culture and love for black American music northward to the clubs in Manchester and Sheffield, where the musicians' union carried less influence. Clubs would become safe havens from the Teddies, their conservative street gang rivals. Every Saturday night would become an all-night dance event, with DJs playing the rarest music that could not be found in stores, even possibly heard on pirate radio. The northern cities were made of heavily industrial communities, filled with hardworking factory workers. The mod's music of choice introduced a 4/4 time R&B soul music at tempos over 100 beats per minute. The all-night dancing was a physical and spiritual release from the soul-crushing work of the factories. In 1967, psychedelic rock took London by storm, but found resistance in the north. The tune-in, drop-out philosophy did not sit well with industrial workers that had to work 9 to 5. The up-tempo dance music of soul and Motown provided enough escapism for the weekends. Also, the hippie culture referred to the metal touches of weed and LSD. The drug of choice amongst the mods, such as amphetamines, were paired well with fast-tempo songs. The influence of these drugs led to a reputation that caught the eye of local authorities. Council members used localized bylaws to shut down a few of these clubs, such as the popular Twisted Wheel Club in Manchester in 1971. The absence of Northern Soul clubs left a void and hunger in the youth populace. In 1973, Northern Soul was reborn through the Wigan Casino, who had offered all-nighters outside local jurisdiction bylaws that plagued the other clubs. Culturally appropriated symbols of the upright black fist used to brand the return of Northern Soul music, whereas in America the same imagery was used for black power and black civil rights. The music of choice was Motown-esque R&B music from before 1967. The popularity of the music brought washed-up and semi-retired acts from America to a second shot of fame in England. The importance of the Northern Soul bridges the gap between English pop music to disco and electronica. English dance music, all-night parties, DJ techniques to keep the music going contributed to the electronica club scene and rave scene later on. It also explains England's thirst for the overpopularized disco music of the late 1970s. It would fit well into the UK dance scene already established in the North and Midlands of the country.
That wicked